Alright guys, so this should hopefully be the last video that I'll have to post for this unit. Today we're going to be talking all about our joints, and hopefully on Friday I will be back and I'll be able to tell you guys all about the skeletal disorders. We'll go over anything that maybe you didn't understand from the videos this week, but for right now, you guys should have watched the joints crash course A&P number 20. That link should be on the PowerPoint on Classroom, or it's also at the top of page 7. I think it's page 7 of your note guide. So you should watch that Hank Green video, fill out the blanks and all the questions, and then right now we're going to be doing, I believe it is page 8, where it says types of joints at the top. So I'm going to tell you guys all about our joints. So if you remember, our bones are supposed to be there for movement, and the only way that we can move our bones is by these things in between our bones called joints. So a joint is basically where our bones connect to each other. Okay, so some of them allow our bones to move, and some of those joints just kind of hold them there. So we've got 3 main types of joints. We have joints that are freely movable, so they can move in almost any direction. And those are going to be called diarthroses. That word is already written for you on your note guide. That just means they're freely movable. Then we've got amphiarthroses. So that means they're slightly movable. They're not as, they don't have as free of movements as the diarthroses, but they can still kind of move around each other if they need to. And then the last kind of joint is called synarthroses. So that means they are not movable. They are simply there to hold our joints together. So the first type of diarthrotic joint, or the freely movable joints, is called the ball and socket joint. So a ball and socket joint allows most movements, pretty much any direction. It basically looks like if you were to take like your fist and then fit the palm of your hand over your fist, that kind of looks like a ball and socket joint. It's just where the head of one bone will fit into a rounded socket of another bone. So this joint will allow you to move in pretty much any direction. Just imagine like a sphere, just rotating around that sphere. You can move pretty much any way around that sphere. So an example of that is our hip or our shoulder. So you can take your arm out and swing it around in circles in the air at your shoulder. That's because of that ball and socket joint. So that joint is just rotating along that ball at the top of your humerus. Then the next kind of diarthrotic joint is the hinge joint. So when I think of a hinge joint, I'm going to think of a door hinge. So if you were to open the door of the classroom, you can only open it in one direction. You can't pull it back all the way through the other direction to open it again. Okay, it only opens in one direction. It only closes in one direction. So that is kind of like our hinge joints. So they can only move in one direction. So an example of that is our elbow. You can open up your elbow to extend your forearm, but you can't bend your forearm all the way back around. It can only move in one direction and then it stops, just like with that door. Same thing with your knee. The elbow and the knee are both types of hinge joints where they only move in one direction. And then the last kind of diarthrotic joint is a pivot joint. So a pivot joint, when something is pivoting, it's kind of moving around something. So you can, if you were standing at the corner of maybe a door frame, you can pivot yourself around that door frame. Or around the corner of a wall, you can pivot around that if you wanted to. So basically, there is an axis, and that bone will rotate around that axis. Usually it's formed when we have kind of a rounded part of a bone, and it fits into sort of a ring that's formed by a ligament. So an example of that would be kind of like a ring in our spine. That specific pivot joint in our spine is called it's called the atlantoaxial joint. The atlantoaxial joint is where the atlas, which is our very top cervical vertebra, it's C1 underneath of our head, and our axis, which is that second cervical vertebra, C2, it's where that joints together, and it allows us to shake our head no. So our head is kind of pivoting along that axis of our spine, but we can't spin it all the way around. If we could, we'd be like an owl. Okay, so that's a pivot joint. So we can move it most of the way around, but not all the way around. If we could move it all the way around, that would be a ball and socket joint in our neck. But instead it's a pivot joint because our head is pivoting along, kind of along our spinal cord is how I like to imagine it. Fun fact, the reason it's called the atlas at the very top, that C1 vertebra, it holds up our head. So there's this old mythological story about this guy named Atlas, and he's this god that holds up the world. He's holding the world on his shoulders. So that's kind of why our C1 is called the atlas, because it is holding up our head, imagining that our head is like the earth. Another example of a pivot joint is a radio-ulnar joint. So our radius and our ulna, remember those are those two bones in our forearm that can kind of rotate around each other. If you're in anatomical position, they're on one side of the arm, and if you turn your arm back around, the bones have kind of crossed over each other. So that is another type of a pivot joint. It's right where the radius and the ulna meet in your elbow. Then we've got those joints that are only slightly movable. So the main one that you guys need to know for this class is called a gliding joint or a plane joint. So with these kinds of joints, the bones are flat. They are planar. So a plane in geometry is just something flat. So these bones are flat and they glide past each other. Okay, so they're kind of like if you put two pieces of paper on top of each other and you move the top piece of paper and just slide it across, that's kind of like this gliding joint. So we have those in our wrist and in our ankle. They're called the intercarpal joints because they're in between our carpals, and the intertarsal joints because they're in between our tarsals. And they just glide past each other. They allow us to move our wrists and to move our ankles. And then that last kind of joint is a synarthrotic joint. So remember, that means they are not movable. Syn, S-Y-N, means without. So it is without movement. So the example of this one is our fixed joints. So this means they cannot move. They are simply there to hold our bones together. So the best example of this is our skull sutures. So those are what hold our skull bones together, like our parietal bone, our frontal bone, our temporal bone, held together by sutures, as you can see in this image right here. So when we are babies, like we learned the other day, we have what's called a fontanelle, which is kind of a gap in our skull bones. And eventually those fontanelles close, and we've got our skull sutures. So when we say skull sutures, a suture is a type of like stitch when you're doing surgery. So it's kind of like how our skull bones are stitched together. That's why they're called skull sutures. Then we've got some disorders of our joints. So if you want to turn to the next page of your note guide, I believe these would be under the arthritic disorders on that second to last page. So we're just going to kind of jump around with the disorders. We're going to talk about most of them in class when I'm back on Friday, hopefully. But we're going to talk about some of the joint disorders right now. So the first one is called arthritis. So arthritis, itis, I-T-I-S, means inflammation or infection. So arthritis is inflammation of our joints. So we've got two main types, and they are very different. While they both cause inflammation in our joints, they both do it a little bit differently. So the main one that you hear about if somebody says, oh, I have arthritis, they're going to be talking about rheumatoid arthritis, most likely. So rheumatoid arthritis is an autoimmune disorder that attacks our joints. So an autoimmune disorder is any kind of disease where our body is attacking itself. So our immune cells recognize things in our body as foreign. It says, hey, this doesn't belong here. And it starts to attack it, even though that part of our body is supposed to be there. So that's what an autoimmune disorder is. So with rheumatoid arthritis, it sees cells in our joints and it attacks them because it thinks that they're foreign. It thinks that they're like germs or things that aren't supposed to be in our body. So all of that attacking of our immune cells causes inflammation in the joint, and it'll be really painful. It'll get swollen. You can see in the picture right here, this one is rheumatoid arthritis, so you'll see this red kind of swelling around that joint. In this picture right here, this is a normal joint. It's not supposed to be that swollen on this side. The other kind of arthritis is called osteoarthritis. So this is a result of aging and wear and tear on the body. So Usually it'll happen as people start to get older. The cartilage in our joints will start to weaken. It'll start to wear down. It'll disappear. And what happens is that the ends of these bones, most commonly you'll see it in people's knees, the ends of these bones will start to wear down. The cartilage will wear down. So the ends of the bones will rub together and it'll be super painful. And that can cause a little bit of inflammation as well. Okay, so osteoarthritis is the bones are rubbing together. You can remember that with the word osteo, that means bone. So that means the bones are rubbing together because there's no longer any cartilage. Rheumatoid arthritis is that autoimmune disorder. So that means the body is attacking the joints and it's causing that inflammation. Then the other kind of joint disorder that we're going to talk about in this class is a sprain. Okay, so if you recall from our first unit when we were talking about connective tissues, our bones are held together at our joints by what's called a ligament. So a ligament is just a type of connective tissue that holds our bones together where our joints are. So a sprain happens when we injure that ligament. So it'll either be torn completely, it might be torn just a little bit, but a sprain is basically when you tear a ligament, so that connective tissue that is holding your bones together at your joint. So what they usually say to treat a sprain is with the acronym RICE. So that stands for rest, ice, compression, and elevation. So you'll see on this slide, this picture uses the word price. So it says protection by avoiding weight bearing on it. If you have a sprained ankle, you're most likely not going to want to bear any weight on it because it's going to hurt. So most people don't have to remember the P in this acronym. But with RICE, that means rest it. So don't participate in any activities that'll involve using your ankle. You just want to kind of relax on the couch or in bed. Don't be walking around on your ankle. Use ice. So ice will help with inflammation in that ankle. So compressing it with like an ice pack, a bag of peas, a lot of people will use. That'll help that swelling to go down. The C stands for compression. So you can use like an ACE bandage around your ankle. There's a certain kind of wrapping that you use for it. I think it's called a spica wrap. That's to just provide support at that ankle so that it stays still and it can heal. And then the last thing is to elevate the leg. So elevation allows your blood to circulate through that injury. It helps bring some good cells in there to help with the healing process, and it'll eventually reduce the swelling as well. So that is to help with a sprain, which is that torn ligament. All right, so that is it for the joints. If you want to work on anything that you didn't finish this week, or if you want to look ahead in the rest of the skeletal disorders and go ahead and just take some notes on those, feel free. Hopefully I will be back on Friday and I'll be able to help you guys through any confusion, but just remember pages 1 through 8 of your note guide, that long bone coloring worksheet, the whack-a-bone game, those will all be due on Friday, and your medical terminology worksheet will be due on Monday. So, and also if you didn't finish your human body photo album yet, I did extend that date until Friday as well. So if you have that and I'm there, you can give me your human body photo album on Friday too. All right. So whatever you guys need to work on for the rest of class after you've watched this video and you've completed your note guide, all the things that are due on Friday, go for it. All right. Hopefully I'll see you guys on Friday.